Well, good morning, Hope Community Church. Welcome to our online service. My name is Pastor Davis. It's really good to have you here on our online service this morning. I do feel like we're in a place where we're ready to revisit one of the reasons that Minneapolis made the headlines in the winter of this year, now that we've had several above 90-degree days in a row in June. We can see what was happening with time covering Minneapolis for reasons of the frozen pants. A couple of our neighborhoods were in fact invaded by frozen pants. Here's one. I think this looks like a South Minneapolis neighborhood. Not exactly sure where. Thought I knew where it was, but then I looked closer and nope, don't recognize that. But a couple of pants just hanging out on the side there. We got this gal who had done a perfect flip with her frozen pants and stuck the landing. Why am I showing you frozen pants? Well, we are in a series right now going through the parables that Jesus told, and we're calling it Uncovering Good News. And you might be surprised to hear that frozen pants, in one sense, are a visual parable. What do I mean by that? Well, they literally are pants that are frozen, but the actors of these frozen pants, the individuals who made these pants frozen for you and I to see and for newspapers to cover, is really offering us a form of visual communication. In essence, they're asking and answering the question, how cold is it outside? Answer, it's frozen pants cold. Stay inside. That is if you like your pants. They're possibly also answering the question, why on earth do I live in a state where my pants can freeze? Well, that is a visual parable. Let's see here. Michelle Lee Barnwell is helpful in describing what actually is going on when Jesus is telling a parable, in addition to frozen pants. In parables, we try to identify, she says, what are called the points of reference. We look for areas that people would immediately identify when they heard it. By knowing the points of reference, we can identify the unexpected turn in the story. The points of reference set up expectations, and the unexpected turn creates a surprise, which is the deeper lesson or the deeper message that the parable is giving. So in addition to frozen pants, Jesus is going to be telling stories that have a deeper lesson underneath them that require us getting our bearings by understanding these points of reference. And so we're going to do that today. We're going to be looking at one of the most confusing, in my opinion, parables that Jesus ever tells, and it's in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all capture this very short but very powerful parable. And I hope that by the end of it, we'll have a good idea of the surprising nature and the brilliance of what Jesus is doing in this very short parable. And we're going to use Mark's rendition, Mark's telling of this parable to work our way through it this morning. It's Mark 2, verses 18 to 22. So let's read the text, and I'll give us a little bit of direction of where I think we're going to go with this, and then we'll get to it. So this is Mark 2, verses 18 to 22. It says, "Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, 'How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?' Jesus answered, 'How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him, the bridegroom, with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No,' Jesus says, 'they pour new wine into new wineskins.'" Just 5 very short verses, but a lot of meat, a lot of density in this parable that Jesus is telling us this morning. Here's where I want us to go. I want us to first respond to the question that's asked, get an understanding of what is this question that Jesus has asked, which is very essentially, why aren't your disciples fasting? But I want us to slow down with that question and ask, where is this question coming from? In other words, what's that question beneath the question that Jesus is being asked? From there, Jesus is going to respond with a two-part answer, a two-part parable in effect. It's kind of like a buy one, get one free. We're Midwesterners, so we love a good BOGO. So Jesus is going to give us a parable BOGO today, and we'll break that down as we go throughout this passage. And from there, I think we're going to start to connect the dots some, but it's, again, a pretty confusing parable. And so I want us to land with making sure we really grasp, what is Jesus trying to do here with this tricky answer to a seemingly simple question? So the question beneath the question, the answer in two parts, and the meaning of the parable. Well, as I said, the passage begins with Jesus being asked what appears to be a pretty simple question. Hey, why aren't you guys doing what other religious people do? Here's the words of Mark. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisee are fasting, but yours are not? Why aren't your disciples fasting when it seems like all these other religious people are doing that thing? To get our bearings around this topic of fasting, I borrowed here from the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible, just to make sure we're getting this point of reference, as Michelle was describing earlier, which is really important to understand a parable. So in the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible, we learn that fasting is eating sparingly or abstaining from food altogether, either from necessity or from desire. In medical terms, fasting is the, big word, detoxification of the body through the restriction of the food. It's the restriction of food. Spiritual fasting entails setting aside activities as well as reducing the intake of food and replacing these activities with the exercise of prayer and preoccupation with spiritual concerns. You're setting aside these things in order to fill yourself with something else, usually some form of a spiritual activity, as is being described. He goes on. In the Old Testament, the fast was regarded as an act of self-renunciation designed to mollify, I had to look this word up, designed to pacify or appease God's wrath and move him to act in gracious disposition. The big idea there is the fast is an action that a human being takes in order to get something from God, in order to move God into a place of activity or response based on the action of the individual. And so who is doing this, and why might they be acting in this religious way? Well, let's back up, look at the text again, and we find that there are two groups. John's disciples, this is most likely John the Baptist, who in Mark's account we learned earlier is doing all sorts of activities. And he has some followers, but it's not just John's followers, it's actually the Pharisees as well. And we've looked a little bit at these Pharisees so far in parables, but essentially these are religious rulers. These are the leaders. And they're doing a good job of attempting to follow what the Old Testament lays out about what God expects of his people and how they should respond, how they should live this out. And a lot of them would have known by heart this verse from Leviticus. You must obey my laws, this is God talking, and be careful to follow my decrees. I am the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I am the Lord. So the Pharisees are experts in religious rules and laws, the decrees that God is talking about here. And they have heard and they've received the message that God gives in the Old Testament about the law, which is do this and you shall live. Now, what are these laws? Essentially, we're talking about dietary restrictions, the 10 Commandments, and things like the behavioral do's and don'ts. So the responsibilities of this is how you are to live. Do things like this, don't do things like this. Pharisees are experts in them, in those things. And on that list, we would include fasting. And so these individuals are telling others, this is what you ought to do. There were several feasts and several fasting rituals that were found in the Old Testament. And these Pharisees were often doing them and telling others to do the same. And I think we can look at the Old Testament and go, I think there's reason to actually do these things. Now, I think that there's a tendency in our modern times here, as modern individuals, to go, this is one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of any type of religious organization, let alone church. There's just too many rules, too many laws, too many do this and don't do that. We can graduate, we can move beyond some of those things in our daily experiences. However, author David Zoll wrote a book called Seculosity, and I love the subtitle here. And essentially what he's doing with this book is trying to describe how no matter where you go, whether you're in a church or you're out in the real world, you really can't escape this do this and live mentality that the Old Testament seems to be marked by. There seems to be a lot of ideas that reflect, almost like a mirror, what Israel, this Old Testament people, was doing in the way they interacted with God. Now, we might not say that we're under the same level of, we're not as worried about God's judgment based on our moral activities, but certainly in our daily experiences, David positions in this book, it seems like we're kind of operating in that exact same fear of messing up type environment, that we're worried of offending some standard, some code, some ethic. And here's how he describes it in everyday experiences. He says this: seculosity, the title of the book, refers to religious devotion or feeling that's directed at earthly rather than heavenly targets. The word itself is a mashup of the secular and religiosity. Having grown up in church, David, I'd leave the gym and think, gosh, that felt a lot like church, and not necessarily the good parts, a sort of be better or else. Or I'd be at the playground and witness a perfect stranger correcting another parent about their child rearing and couldn't help but notice that it felt like certain fanatical strands of American religion, where there's an intense focus on behavioral purity, and everyone was basically afraid of messing up all the time. Do you hear that? Can you relate to the experiences of David's observation here? David's saying, just look around at the experiences of your everyday life. Whether you're at the playground, the gym, on your job, is there not some form of purity that's dominating the rule or the cultural norm of that environment? And really any type of fear or anxiety you might have is to transgress the laws that have been laid out there. It's a wild idea. And when we start to believe it a little bit, or maybe hold the category itself as a handle, or see through the lens of law being present in more than just religious institutions, we start to see that it's everywhere. One example that I remember from a couple years ago is Ronda Rousey. She was an MMA fighter who was on the up and up. Her first 12 fights, she dominated, 8 of them in the first minute. She was new to the sport and just could not be stopped. And when it came to the law or the rule of performance in this sport, she was at the top of the game. And it filled her with elation, right? Look at that photo there on the left. She is pumped about her performance of meeting the standards of this institution. And the law does that to us. But something happened after the 12th fight. She went into a fight where she really expected to be the top dog. There was almost no chance that she was going to lose, but lo and behold, she did. And later that week, she was interviewed by Ellen, and she has this tearful response as she reflects on her experiences as this up-and-comer, filled with success, as she was meeting the standards of what was put out there, and then falling to the bottom of the sport. Or even in just that one fight, the infraction of the performance that she had put out, this is her remark to Ellen. She says, honestly, at the end of this fight, my thought in the medical room, I was sitting in the corner and was like, what am I anymore if I'm not this? Literally sitting there thinking about killing myself. In that exact second, I'm like, I'm nothing. What do I do anymore? When her performance was interrupted by failure, when she was no longer living up to the code or the ethic of what she thought she should be, this standard of I'm okay no longer being met with one single infraction, Rhonda's experience is one of being undone. She has no self-conception based on this one infraction of the law, and the law here just being the performance of the sport. Similar to the Israelites' law of hearing, do this and live, in other words, don't do this and die, Rhonda's experience in just an everyday environment was one of the exact same principle. In the midst of performance failing, In the midst of her control being interrupted by circumstances that were outside of her ability to dominate, she now has no direction, no up from down, and she shares that with Ellen. Just, what am I if I'm not this thing? Now, interestingly, she finishes the interview and talks about how a love from outside of herself interrupts that feeling, but that's getting ahead of ourselves in the passage. But it is a great interview, and that's why I use her here as this example, because of her sense of okayness was interrupted by a lack of performance. So what is it for you, whoever or whatever you're turning to today, to get some sense of stability, some sense of, I'm okay based on the things that I do? What might that be? Because the law puts the ball in our court. It gives us a sense of control, a sense of okayness based on performance. It's always a belovedness that has a condition attached to it. In other words, I know I'll be loved, I know I'll be accepted, I know I'll be embraced by what I do, by what others might think of me, by my performance in XYZ environment, by what I put out there for the world to see. I know I'm okay based on what I do. The Apostle Paul, just a side note, in the New Testament argues very persuasively under these terms, just saying, Israel's not unique for having the law. In one sense they are, but in another sense, look around. The law is dominating human life, and it looks like burden. It looks like pressure. It looks like not measuring up to a standard and constantly feeling what Rhonda is describing here in this interview. The Old Testament takes this principle when Israel tries to take the law and have a sense of control and stability in their life based on what they do, and it always turns in on itself. Hear the words of Isaiah. When the people of God are asking God, why have we fasted? Same principle here from our New Testament passage. And you see it not. They ask God, why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? God's response through Isaiah, behold, in the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure and you oppress all your workers. Don't miss that. The fast that these individuals were doing was really about self. It was really about taking God under control and garnering some response, some degree of favor based on what they do. And God calls the bluff because God sees the heart, not just the performance on the outside. And he says that through these words in Isaiah. So the question beneath the question that we're seeing here today is, why aren't you observing the law? Why aren't you doing the things that you're expected to do if you're in that religious camp? And Jesus is going to now respond to that, and he's going to do so in a bit of a tricky way. He's going to do so with a BOGO parable, as we mentioned earlier. You're going to get a buy one, get one free as a result of Jesus's answer. The first part of his answer is that he takes us from it's almost like a movement out of fasting to feasting. Listen to these words. He says, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day, they will fast. What Jesus is bringing to the table here, what Jesus has with his disciples who are not fasting, is something different. And it doesn't look like fasting according to Jesus. In fact, Jesus is saying it's inappropriate to fast, kind of like it would be if you were in a wedding. Not just even at a wedding, but like if you're in the wedding, if you're the best man of a wedding and you're given up to give your speech and you're kind of tipping your cup to the happy couple. And I just imagine, as I was reading this passage, a best man getting up and being so excited, so delighted, a best friend for life, finally getting married. And he's just like, I am so thrilled to be here today, celebrating this love that the two of you have. Look around. I mean, they got this amazing buffet of food. You probably spent way too much for it, but I do have a question. You see, I started Whole30 yesterday, and I just want to make sure, is this Whole30 approved? That would be a ridiculous question. It's so out of place and so inappropriate for a best man to do that, whether it was in the speech or not. Hypothetically, it's ridiculous. Why? Because he's offending the norms of what's happening. He's offending the party itself. The wedding is not about the best man. The wedding is about the couple and these two coming together as one, being united before friends and family and ultimately God, and it is reason to celebrate. Just like it is today, it was back then. Hear about weddings during the Old Testament time. Are these celebration feasts that are going to be celebrating two becoming one. It says, because of God's goodness, these days, these weddings were to be celebrated with great joy by everyone living in the land, including men and women, boys and girls, servants, widows, orphans, and even foreigners. The people left the feast with hearts overflowing with praise for all that God had done. Feasts, wedding feasts in the Old Testament were all about the provision of God in providing for the couple that's getting married. But it wasn't just about the couple, it's about everybody that comes to this feast to celebrate. And all of them stop their work and come and party with everybody in the community. And look at that last sentence again. They leave with their hearts overflowing with praise for all that God had done. And again, imagine Jesus' response to this question. Why aren't your disciples fasting? I just picture the disciples behind Jesus experiencing just a taste of what's being described here. While everybody else is trying to obey these religious codes and these moral oughts, Jesus' disciples are behind him with hearts overflowing with praise for all that God has done. Why? Because Jesus is saying, I'm a living, walking wedding party. And you're missing that as you're trading me in for a religious practice. You're totally missing what's going on here. Jesus is flipping the question back on its head, saying, why are you fasting? The question is not why are we not, it's why are you when you're at or in the presence of the individual that causes great celebration. This is Jesus' answer to the question. How can they fast? It would be completely inappropriate for them to do so. There are two verses I want to pull from the Old Testament that Jesus seems to be borrowing from as he's describing this. The first is from Isaiah 62:5. I try to read this at every wedding that I have the opportunity to officiate because I love the imagery of what God is doing here. He's basically saying any wedding that you attend is really a glimpse. It's an illustration. It's an analogy. In one sense, it's a visual parable of what God desires to do with his people. Marriage is designed by God to tell us about God. And just as, this is Isaiah's words, a young man marries a young woman, so will your builder marry you. Capital B, builder. God himself, the one who built you and created you, desires that level of intimacy with his people. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so will your God rejoice over you. Interesting that Jesus is borrowing this type of language that is reserved for God, this bridegroom language that causes celebration for all. Jesus is co-opting that and saying, it's happening. Right now, it's breaking in before you, and so it would not make sense for you to fast. Another verse here from the Old Testament is in the prophet Zechariah. Really big language in Zechariah, but it's amazing, amazing words that are pointing to the person of Jesus. He says this, thus says the Lord of hosts, the fast, now we're in the language of fasting here. Zechariah is going to describe the movement from fasting to feasting. He says, the fast of the 4th month and the fast of the 5th and the fast of the 7th and the fast of the 10th shall be to the house of Judah seasons of joy and gladness and cheerful, and there's the surprising term, it turns a little bit, feasts. The fasts are going to move out of that realm of no longer filling yourself in order to get to God, but actually of being fed by God. Fast to feast. In those days, 10 men from the nations of every tongue shall hold of the robe of a Jew, saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Now, this should have been the response of the individual who's asking Jesus, why aren't you guys fasting? He should have taken the robe of Jesus and said, we hear that God is with you. In fact, we hear that you are God and that there's reason for celebration here. The fast is actually moving into a feast, just like Zechariah promised. So Jesus' first answer to this is that we're moving out of that realm of fasting to feasting. We're moving out of activity, and it's more about the person whose presence you actually keep, who provides this type of feast. Now, the second answer that Jesus is going to give is where things get a little dicey. Things get a little confusing. And I want us to slow us down and make sure we're tracking what Jesus' point of reference is here, because he's going to give the second parable. And within the second parable, there's kind of two illustrations. So another BOGO, two BOGOs for the price of one BOGO. BOGO. Here's where Jesus takes us. He's going to take us from old to new. He says, no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins. The point is, big picture, you can't fit the new into the old. Hear the words of Paul Isaac as we try to understand a little bit more where he's going with this. Jesus tells this double parable. A piece of cloth from a new garment is not used to patch an old one, because taking the piece would damage the new garment. New wine is not put into old wineskins, for they are brittle and they would burst. Rather, new wine is stored into new wineskins. Okay, getting our bearings a little bit. Sometimes when I get stuck on a passage like this, I just start to chart it out. So to start with, we have new being put into the old. And the first illustration is of a garment. If you have a hole in a garment, like a pair of jeans or sweatpants, maybe is a better analogy because it's more likely to shrink. Taking a unshrunken piece of sweatpants, piece of cloth that hasn't gone through the washing machine yet and dried and shrunk, and putting it onto the hole of the old sweatpants. That's the first illustration, right? Followed by this wineskins idea. The new thing is new wine, and he's saying, no one puts it into old wineskins. We don't use wineskins anymore for this actual reason, in fact, because you only get one shot with one wineskin. Once you fill it with wine, this is an animal skin of some kind, the fermentation process happens while it's in the wineskin, and it's flexible enough that it's actually going to stretch out. As you can kind of even see in this image, there's kind of that like wet looking part because it's stretching as the fermentation process is happening. If you pour new wine into that, what's the result? This is where Jesus takes us next. The result of the first is that a worse tear will be made on that garment because the cloth will shrink and a bigger hole will be made, okay? For the wine, both will be destroyed. Why? Because the stretching has already happened in the wineskin. Oh, there we go. How does it happen? For the wine, it bursts because the stretching is already starting to take place. And for the patch, the worst tear is made as it's put onto the old. Why? Because new cloth is made for new clothes, while new wine is made for new wineskins. If you pour new wine into the old wineskins, there's no room for it to grow, or it will, in fact, burst. We're starting to track a little bit. Big idea is we can't blend the two. The new thing can't be put onto the old, or it's going to make the old situation worse. Whether that's a garment being pulled and the hole being grown, or that's new wineskins where the new wine is going to go into the old and it's going to burst and you got wine everywhere and the wineskins busted as well. I think we're starting to track. Jesus is employing new language here about with a movement from old to new. Now, if you're of the first century mindset, you're likely to go to a place in the Old Testament that is the watershed moment of a movement from old to new. And this is in the prophet Jeremiah. This is what he says. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the old covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt. So we're seeing this new category of a movement from old to new, and Jesus is talking, or God here through the prophet Jeremiah is talking about that taking place with a covenant, God's relationship with the people, how he interacts with them based on this covenant. And notice that there's a difference between the old and the new, that the new will not be like the old. So we're starting to see, maybe there's some overlap there with this parable that Jesus is giving, but how does it all fit together? I think we've tracked with the double parable, the answer in two parts, but now I want us to make sense of this. I want us to connect the dots a little bit. How do we put this seemingly confusing answer to what appeared to be a pretty straightforward question that Jesus is offering. How do we make sense of this? Well, let's walk back through the big idea very shortly. Jesus is asked a question, why don't these people fast? Jesus answers, it would be inappropriate to fast because you're in the presence of the bridegroom. This is why they're not fasting. So Jesus takes that question about an activity, question about the law being obeyed, some principle, some standard being obeyed, and he says it's actually really not about obedience to a standard at all. It's about being in the presence of the one who is right before you. So he's starting to shift it a little bit, but then he does a double shift. This is the great turn, the great surprise of the passage is here in this double parable with the wineskins and the garment. Because notice that Jesus is talking about this unshrunk cloth and this old, or the shrunken cloth, the old garment, and the old wineskins. And he's causing us to come a little bit closer as he's wanting us to say, where am I in this passage? What object am I in the parable? I thought I was somebody who was just doing the activity like the person who asked the question, but now I'm being confronted to ask, in whose presence am I? But Jesus is turning up the volume even more to go into a place of, are you old or are you new? Because the old thing can't hold the new, and whatever Jesus is bringing, it's the new thing, and it will not fit into old. The old looks like the question that Jesus is being asked here. Why aren't you? There's an obedience to the law question being asked, and Jesus wants us to see that's an old question. If you ask that type of question, if that's your posture with how you're relating to God, you're going to miss everything Jesus is bringing here. Everything Jesus is bringing here. There's a movement from old to new that's taking place, and Jesus just surprised us with the reality of the reality and the question of, are we old or are we new? And I think he wants us to see, we're old. If we're trying to put Jesus into any type of standard, any type of, this is what you ought to do, we're gonna lose it. The hole is gonna be made worse on our system, or worse, we're going to lose Jesus altogether and the new wine will be poured out while the wineskin itself breaks. How, then, can we be made new? That's the challenging question here, because old wineskins and old garments can't will themselves to be made new. Something else needs to happen, something outside of us, and the answer is here in the passage. We didn't spend a lot of time on this part of the passage, but Jesus in verse 20 says, the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day, they will fast. There is a time coming when Jesus, the bridegroom, will be taken away, and on that day, they will fast. And commentators agree almost unanimously, this is Jesus' first articulation of his impending death. The very reason he comes to earth is to do this, is to be the bridegroom who is taken away. These are the words of Isaiah 53. By oppression and judgment, he, the bridegroom, was taken away. In the Old Testament, this forward-looking passage about what's going to happen to the one who's going to make old things new is first a taking away. And what's that taking away do? Yet who of this generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people, he was punished. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, God, my righteous servant, will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Big prophetic language about the taking away of this future bridegroom in order to heal the people who are old, in order to make the old new. Jesus picks up on these words, and at the end, towards the middle of Mark's gospel, he begins to teach them about what Isaiah was talking about. It says he begins to teach his disciples that the Son of Man, Jesus, the bridegroom, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed. And after 3 days rise again. And notice, he speaks plainly about this. He doesn't speak in a parable anymore when he starts to describe, this is why I'm here. I am here to die. We just finished the series in Hebrews, but Hebrews gives us clarity now to go back to our wineskins passage and start to connect these dots. When the author of Hebrews writes to us saying, we have confidence to enter the most holy place, namely the new thing that God is doing, the presence of God. How? By the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened up for us through the curtain. That is his body. Let us go back then to our passage and see the cross start to clarify. This tricksy, confusing parable that Jesus is giving is really a brilliant call to the future thing that he's going to do for his people when he's strung up on a cross to die in our place. Jesus himself is identifying with the new wine of this passage, but not only that, he's saying the thing that you need to move from old to new is not an activity that you do. It's not a law to be kept. It's to see me, the bridegroom, the one who fasted for you from all things in heaven so that you might feast with me eternally. But not only that, Jesus is the new cloth, taking the old way, the old curtain that separated us from God and tearing it. How? By the tearing of his own body when he was strung up in our place to die. Jesus is the new wine of the parable, who was poured into the old covenant of the law to fulfill it perfectly and bursted at the seams and be ruined. His blood was spilled on the ground like wine so that that old covenant system of do this and live would no longer apply to those who access God by his blood and torn body in our place. Jesus is the new wine of this passage. And it's the best news in the universe. And it's a surprise confrontation of you need to be made new, but it's not going to happen by anything you do. It's going to happen by looking at the cross. Jesus is bringing a movement out of fasting into feasting, out of old into new, out of rote law keeping into looking and beholding the Son who was strung up in our place that we might have life and have it in abundance, that we would never doubt God's place in our life, that he would always be the one that we would have access to because of the grace that he gives, not because of anything that we do. There's a great song that I think covers this well, done by the Common Hymnal. It's called "The Cross Made the Change." And I just want these lyrics to be said to you, to be believed, right where you're at this morning. Hear these words from the Common Hymnal. Nobody thought that this son of sorrows, language of Isaiah 53, would be broken for love to fix our tomorrows. Now, when we see Jesus, we become like Jesus. When we know how he sees us, we will never be the same. So as we close, I just want to ask us as a church, as a community, today, are we approaching God on the terms that he's giving, the terms that he's interrupting our law keeping with? Or are we doing so in the old way? Because if we do, we're going to miss not only him, but the very systems that we're operating under will eventually offend us when we infract upon them. So let's approach God with the invitation that he's giving us here in this passage, namely through the death and resurrection of his Son, who is life and life in the full. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for this word that you give us, this word that is amazing, and there's so much depth to it, and it's so surprising and often confrontational in ways that make us think on where am I in this passage? How am I old? How am I trying to fit you, God, into a box? How am I trying to measure up to some standard that is only going to leave me lifeless and anxious and insecure? God, help us to hear and believe again with fresh eyes that you, Jesus, fasted from heaven for us, that we might feast forever at your table. Jesus, you are the new cloth. You are the new wine. You have opened up a door for us that we might have life and have it to the full. And we receive this now as a gift from you. Amen. Well, I do invite you, I think it's fitting for this passage to take communion together. If you have anything at home, that can serve as the broken bread that Jesus hands his disciples, that demonstrates his broken body, as we saw in this passage, the thing that was broken, that we might be brought in. Let's go ahead and take that together now. And it says, we're told in the Gospels that Jesus pours out wine, and he gives it to his disciples and says, "This is the blood of the new covenant given for you. Take this and believe and drink it in. Let your heart feast on the reality of God given for your sins and risen again to new life in full." Let us drink together. Thanks again for joining Hope. We'll see you again next week, same time, same place. Want to extend an invitation to you as well. We are meeting in person. Would love to have you join us, 8:30 and 10:30 a.m. at our downtown location. We'll see you then.